All right, welcome back. I think just to recap some of the points that we emphasized in our discussions on the China African relationship. One, the importance of natural resources, the fact that whether it concerns energy security, whether it concerns diplomatic support, there is an interest which is there on the African continent, which is primarily of an economic nature. Perhaps that might be the core of China's interests in Africa. The second point that we made relating to the kind of credit lines that are extended, the kind of other assistance which is given, um, I think we have to bear in mind that there is a certain approach associated with the Beijing consensus that sort of focuses on execution of projects, financing of initiatives, all from a very detached point of view. The concern being that I'm there to make money, I'm there to uh, sort of get returns on my investment, um, and the other concerns relating to what might be the human rights record of the particular ruling dispensation, or what might be the other record of the ruling dispensation, that may not be my concern. Something which we come across when we discuss the Washington consensus and the overall approach to development aid financing extended by the West to some of these countries. Um, the last point here again stresses on a genuine resentment which is there in some of these countries locally, wherein the countries feel that the practice of bringing in labor to work on site, even though it might be ostensibly in the name of um, communication or efficiency as far as executing projects is concerned, um, still does not seem to hold much water, right? So just to conclude, I think in terms of the last slide here that we have, um, one, I think based on some of the perception survey that represents how local people in Africa feel about China, the picture of China is not as negative as one would have expected from the kind of narrative that usually emerges, right? So um, if you were to look at the kind of narrative that emerges about China, it ranges on the one end from being extremely acerbic, from being extremely security minded in terms of, the Chinese intention of the Chinese rise is purely perceived as some kind of a threat for other countries. From that extreme to another extreme where maybe locals itself in Africa feel that, as a development model, they feel that this represents the second best model that they could see. Possibly the first best being their impression of how the US emerged as the leading power in the last century, primarily as the result of a very open policy towards attracting immigrants, the kind of role that different immigrant groups were able to play in the US, the kind of role that rule of law had in the US, the kind of strong institutions that were built. Possibly that might represent to them the best model of growth, right? And this nonetheless comes in second. The impression seems to be improving over the last couple of years, particularly if you look at the kind of developments which have been made to institutionalize this cooperation. So if you look at the last point, the mention of FOCAC being the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, something that has been actively pursued since the last 7 odd years, right? And not that before that there was no interaction. Before that, of course, at the ministerial level, at the top level, there was plenty of interaction, but now it's been sort of formalized into China's engagement with Africa being through this very top regionalization effort, right? So this perception has been improving over the years, and the economic opportunities offered by China seem to have received most attention. I was reading somewhere relating to Kenya's economic performance, and it was a pleasant surprise that Kenya seems to be growing, at least for the last several years, seems to be growing at a decent rate between 3 to 5% consistently. And the number one source of financing in Kenya seems to be the kind of money that is coming in um, from China. And mind you, this is a relationship that also is being pursued by the Americans seriously. But if you look at what's been the development over the last couple of days, I mean, we are trying to even update the course vis-a-vis developments that have happened in the last couple of days, and it's very evident that by cutting off US aid financing to some of these countries, the situation seems to be again skewed in China's favor as far as the kind of access these countries would have to development finance. The obvious question that will come to mind is, if nobody is interested in development finance for these countries, do we expect Africa to remain poor? Do we expect Africa to continue the burdens of imperial extraction and the kind of underdevelopment that was resulting from that kind of colonial experience? And nobody in their right mind would say that yes, let them continue with that. Of course, they deserve a better life, they deserve financing projects to be executed. And the obvious question comes then when, if China is interested to execute projects, roads, stadiums, schools, ports, and all of that there, why not the rest of the world be forthcoming in also doing the same, right? So with that question, it becomes very difficult to find answers in black and white, and you have to sort of examine these answers in the gray shade, right? So I think with this discussion, I'll move on to the next segment, which is basically now we, in the course of the past several weeks, have managed to fairly reasonably cover China in its neighborhood, China in its economic progress, China in its major relationships, including India, and of course, we've tried to sort of look at regional blocks like the BRICS Plus. We've gone beyond the immediate neighborhood to as far as Africa, and we've looked at disputes near, like the South China Sea, and we've looked at sort of major issues relating to the rivalry with the US. So now I think it would make sense to sort of focus on what is the prognosis for the future. What does the future look like? I think I would not be the first and neither the last among scholars who've predicted this century to be the Asian century, right? And countries like China, countries like India will have a major role to play in this century. And it's almost as if there's a certain era that has passed by in the last um, 500 odd years, before which we had China and India in a very advantageous position. If you look at all of the data till the 13th, 14th, 15th century, right? And it's after that that you begin to see that you go through different periods where at one point in time the Portuguese might have been very powerful, the Spanish would have been very powerful, the Dutch would have been very powerful, the British would have been very powerful, and then you had Europe coming up in a big way, and then you had the Americans coming up in a big way. But now it seems to be that after each of those, and it's beautiful to discuss history in terms of long cycles, because then you get a clearer picture that it's almost as if now the economic muscle is coming back to Asia, right? And therefore it makes sense, of course, because we are doing a paper on China in contemporary global politics, to also look at what the prognosis looks like, what the future looks like. So therefore we'll switch to the next topic, and let's see some talking points related to this, right? So I think when we look at the way ahead, um, the way forward, I think the most recent instance of um, China declaring economic targets was the conclusion of the two sessions that they had earlier this year. The two sessions was basically a gathering of top lawmakers from the major political organizations, that act as some kind of uh, a representative will of the people, right? So the National People's Congress and the CPPCC, they came together, they identified what should be the major goals, they identified problems relating to urban employment, they identified problems relating to youth unemployment, they interestingly identified problems relating to agrarian targets. I was very interested when I read some of the reports coming in, and this is just the last few weeks that these things have come about. I was very curious when I read that they've explicitly laid out a target for 700 million metric tons of food grain production, which might be indicative of some serious changes that they anticipate in their global ecosystem. A country that anticipates grain production, storage of grain, is anticipating some kind of disturbance globally. And till now, we've been looking at major sources of agrarian import for China to be places like the US, Brazil. And given what's been happening in the recent few weeks, I thought I should bring you up to speed with these developments also. That, when I read targets being fixed for agricultural output, I wanted to check what's been the discussion in the US Congress. And I was very surprised that last year, the US Congress had a very high level congressional hearing wherein they would now proscribe or restrict China's access to agrarian assets in the US. That's a very interesting development. This happened 1 year ago, and a few weeks ago, they have set their targets for grain production. I hope all of this, I mean, you know, you can only be a fortune teller to some extent, but in these matters, I hope, what this portends is not something which is disturbing. One hopes that, good sense prevails. And of course, there is a need to understand that, both the US and China might be interested to decouple more and more for obvious reasons. The kind of role that China has in today's world economy, accounting for roughly 30% of the world's manufacturing. 30% of the world's manufacturing, if I compare it historically to any country that had this kind of a role in global statistics, it was the United Kingdom during the Industrial Revolution, it was the United States at the end of World War I, and now it is China that has such a predominant position, right? And these are like hardcore data, and these are very updated numbers, just to bring you up to speed with what's happening in the current context. Because these are very dynamic events. I mean, who would have predicted that, tariffs would have thrown this kind of a debate, wherein all of these years we were trying to work towards predictable environment. So, you need to have something like the most favored nation status, where I cannot treat another country differently on the basis of different tariffs just because I have some differences. And having spent years working towards that goal, now you have suddenly tariffs being thrown about 32%, 90%, 124%, and all of these numbers differentially being imposed. So it's a very dynamic environment. But of course, we are in a position to also tackle this, given the fact that we've discussed China's reforms in depth in terms of what their goals are, in terms of what their challenges are. This point relating to sort of agrarian output was something that caught my attention, but beyond that, of course, aspects relating to reducing population in China is a big cause of concern. The last 2 years consecutively, there's been a singular drop in China's population, right? The last 2 years back to back, there's been a drop in China's population. They have been trying to deal with it, they have been trying to redress it, but it's not that easy, right? Natural rates of population growth, as we discussed previously when we were discussing major long-term challenges to the Chinese economy, is not that easy to correct. You look at Japan, they are dealing with that problem since the late 1980s. Until today, they've not been able to come out of it. You look at many of the Scandinavian countries, they are dealing with this problem and it's not easy to come out of it, right? And China, again, it's trying its best for various reasons. I mean, if you face some kind of a block by virtue of the kind of tariffs somebody wants to impose, where do you start selling these products? You have to look at alternate supply chains. You have to look at alternate partners. Maybe there is an even closer cooperation that you can expect between China and its immediate neighborhood, ASEAN. Maybe there is a bigger kind of cooperation you can expect between China and Europe, because even friends, foes, all of them seem to have been hit by the kind of shock that tariffs have introduced. So I just thought I'll bring you up to speed with some of these recent developments. But I think the most important thing to bear in mind is that the China story is something that has completely upset the equilibrium as far as the world is concerned. Till now, we would have discussed it in theory, rivalry, great power competition. But now, in the matter of the last few weeks, we've actually seen what that and how that impacts maybe the great powers in figuring out how do we deal with this growth, right? So I think, given this current context, some of the policy directions that were infused as far as China's domestic policies are concerned can be traced back to the 19th National Congress of the Communist Party in 2017. Mind you, in one of the earlier lectures, I had clearly laid out to you that whether it was Obama, whether it was Trump, whether it was Biden, now Trump, there's been a consistent effort that the US has been making in order to try and check the kind of prominence that China has, and they've been not that successful. I mean, this last resort is a shock measure, right? I mean, I hope you understand that this is meant to create some kind of a shock, because all of the other things were not able to keep China down. And if you therefore look back at the policy direction that was infused into China's political thinking, the 19th National Congress in 27 sort of outlined this major theme, right? The historic milestone here. And I'll just read it out. Secure a decisive victory in building a moderately prosperous society in all respects, and strive for the great success of socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era, right? Not that they were doing too bad in 2017, they were actually doing pretty good. This is pre-COVID. They were actually preparing for some kind of soft landing because they were growing so fast in terms of the growth rates. And at that time, they felt that, you need to build a moderately prosperous society. And so we look at the timeline, they were looking at some goals for 2035. They were looking at some goals for 2050, middle of the century, and so on. So they articulated it in 2017 as part of the National People's Congress. The theme of the 19th Congress was remain true to our original aspiration, keep our mission firmly in mind, hold high the banner of socialism with Chinese characteristics, secure a decisive victory in building a moderately prosperous society in all respects, strive for the great success of socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era, and work tirelessly to realize the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation, right? Many important themes that have been stressed here. If I were to read it backwards, the first phrase that comes to mind, national rejuvenation. Very clearly, the discourse earlier, if I compare it to Deng Xiaoping's view would have been bide your time, hide your capabilities, do something meaningful. Deng Xiaoping had a view that bide your time, hide your capabilities, put your head to the steering wheel, keep your focus on economic growth, keep your focus, don't do something extraordinary. There's no need to attract attention internationally by making a noise every time something happens. Keep your focus on economic growth. And that was a certain kind of modesty that all of us are quite used to in an Asian context, right? We might have cracked a very coveted entrance to get into this institution. We might have cracked a couple of other exams or won certain honors or awards, but the first thing that comes in mind in an Asian context would be, even in terms of wisdom from elders, would be that there is no need to make a big deal out of it. There are occasions when you are quite elated. There must be occasions when you feel little low. Learn to deal with both situations equally, so that when life goes on, you have the strength to deal with every situation. Now, supposing if you deal with some kind of a situation in a very elated manner, and then all of a sudden there's something that happens to the other side, it becomes very difficult to control your response. So this kind of an advice, bide your time, hide your capability, do something meaningful, is something that relates to an overall Asian context. But compared to that, if you look at the kind of shift which is happening, the talk of national rejuvenation, the fact that you have to strive for great success, this is a different kind of a discourse, and it's coming from Xi Jinping. It's coming in a recent context where the party is trying to give a new direction, and the idea is that hold high the banner of socialism with Chinese characteristics. This is a very interesting coinage, right? Now, when you say socialism, there might be something which underlies socialism in terms of what socialism is. But when you qualify it by a suffix like socialism with Chinese characteristics, you are further trying to clarify a certain kind of position that you represent. What might be this position? A, China has been growing very fast. This might have resulted in some people growing more wealthy compared to others. This might have created some kind of inequality, both interpersonal as well as interprovincial. And if somebody challenges you that this is the outcome that you worked for, this is the kind of inequality that you see in society, then you should be able to defend that by saying that we are still on the path to achieving the final goal. This is socialism with Chinese characteristics. So that is why this phrase becomes interesting, right? And the other part, I think, is pretty self-explanatory, trying to build a moderately prosperous society. Again, uh, maybe that is the interim goal. Of course, subsequently, in the long run, as one economist said, that in the long run we are all dead. So at least we can forecast for the medium term that build a moderately prosperous society. The implication being that, as I mentioned, the earlier policy of the 1980s under Deng Xiaoping, which was to observe calmly, secure our position, cope with affairs calmly, hide your capacities, bide our time, be good at maintaining a low profile, and never claim leadership. I think this is some kind of a contrast, right, in terms of what they would like to be. Let's see in terms of other aspects. So, what were some of the key steps that must have accompanied this kind of a thinking? And one of the key, I think, instruments, that might be the best word, that reflects this idea of wanting to secure some kind of decisive victory, wanting to be a moderately prosperous society. I think one major instrument has been the Belt and Road Initiative. Previously, it was the One Belt One Road. I think in recent years they've shifted it to the BRI. That's why I kept both usages. This was a policy which was announced under the current leader, Xi Jinping. Um, and over the years, of course, the number is so dynamic. Many countries have become part of this initiative. It aims, interestingly, uh, to connect by the belt. The usage of one belt, one road, what that means, connect by the belt the entire expanse of China across Central Asia to Europe. That's one. And that's interestingly the belt. And the road that was envisaged, interestingly, was on water. So the entire connectivity that they envisaged from China to Southeast Asia to the African continent and then Latin America, that was envisaged as the road. So if you're wondering why did they call it One Belt, One Road, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative is the same acronym that represents the initiative, but broadly, the sum and substance of it is to create um, connectivity, to create partnerships that steer clear of the kind of geopolitics that China was anticipating. Mind you, they were anticipating right from 2013 that increasingly it's going to be difficult, particularly when you've been able to deliver strong rates of growth. 2013 was very clearly coming after the 2008 financial crisis. It was coming after the Eurozone crisis. So they pretty much had dealt with serious disturbances, including regional disturbances like previously the East Asian financial crisis. So having dealt with all that, they had a pretty healthy rate of growth. They knew that this kind of a prominence that takes them to overtake the Japanese, to overtake the Germans, and then become the second largest economy will not be a comfortable path. So the idea was connect with as many regions as possible, have infrastructure projects in these places. We are good at building infrastructure. We've previously discussed in the context of economic reforms, there was a classical Keynesian strategy at work to encourage this kind of growth. And therefore the idea was to make as many friends possible by such connectivity, right? And so when you look at this kind of connectivity, many countries who would oppose the BRI would be countries with which China has had differences, right? So if I give you a map of how that looks, it's very evident when you look at the white spots in the map, right? It's fairly obvious that in terms of the intense red, the lighter red, that's where connectivity, BRI projects, all of it is going on. So you can see the whole of China, Central Asia, Middle East, Africa, parts of Europe, parts of Latin America, the further down Southeast Asia, some of the Micronesian islands and those areas, all of them responding favorably, right? And this number is very dynamic. I mean, if you look at 147 countries being part of the BRI or having signed on to projects, that number might actually change by the week, by the month, right? Any new project that gets announced. And so the connectivity and the kind of reach that the BRI envisages accounts for roughly 2/3 of the world's population and 40% of global GDP. That's a very impressive kind of club that might be your parallel supply chain. That might be the other set of countries with which you would now think of pursuing the kind of growth that you have in mind, given the fact that there is a certain kind of geopolitics that plays out, right? So I'll stop here, and more when we meet in the next class.